Welcome back. I'm Steve Kelley. I am the Deputy Director of the Center for Integrative Leadership and a Senior Fellow here at the Humphrey School. The Center for Integrative Leadership conducts research, teaching, and outreach related to building skills in working across the public, nonprofit, and private sectors, the corporate sector in Minnesota. We think that it's important for solving the kinds of grand challenges that our society faces. Our steering committee picked as one of the 4 grand challenges that the center would focus on. One of the topics was regional social and economic vitality. So one of our activities is a biannual research conference. So for the fall of 2014, we'll be hosting a conference on regional social and economic vitality. And our thinking was that this ought not be just a one-time event, that we ought to think of this as a series of events tied together by that theme, which we have called the Vital Life as our project for the coming year. And this, when I heard from Lee about this event and the work that he was doing, it struck me that this was a perfect opportunity for us to partner in this event as part of this Vital Life series. And we expect to do a few more events in 2014 before the research conference. So I'm really pleased to be part of this, and we have a terrific panel, and this panel's job is to look forward and basically answer the question, where do we go from here? And I will introduce all of our panel members briefly, though their accomplishments deserve a good deal more in the way of recognition. So Phil Barnes is on the far right. He's the Alternative Transportation Finance Director for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. He's been involved in a variety of innovative finance ideas at MnDOT, and before coming to MnDOT as part of his preparation, he graduated from the Federal Highway Administration's Professional Development Program. He also has a Bachelor of Science in Finance from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And then next to him is Libby Starling, who is one of our graduates from the Masters of Urban and Regional Planning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And she is the project manager for Thrive MSP 2040, which is the Metropolitan Council's 30-year regional plan. She's the manager of regional policy and research for the council, and before coming to the council, served in a number of research and policy planning roles. Then Peter Frosch is the manager of partnerships for Greater MS, strategic partnerships for Greater MSP. We've been working closely with Peter on issues related to the strategic planning at Greater MSP, and I think we'll hear something more about the competitive intelligence point that Mike Langley made earlier. He received his Master's in International Relations from the Dublin City University in Ireland, and before coming to the Greater MSP, he was the Legislative Director for Congresswoman Betty McCollum. Tom Fisher is the Dean of the College of Design and the co-director of the Metropolitan Consortium, and Tom is the author of numerous books related to architecture and design, and has been leading the college in some things I've enjoyed learning more about in terms of public interest design, and how we can use design to improve the lives of all of the folks who are facing numerous challenges. Jim Hovland is the mayor of Edina and the co-chair of the Regional Council of Mayors. He's a lawyer in private practice, and we are fortunate to have all of these panel members with us. Let's see, Phil, why don't we just go down Phil, start with you and go down the row.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introductions. And I'm really happy to be here specifically about talking about some of the great work the university is doing here with this industry cluster studies. It's really cutting edge stuff and stuff that I think is going to be very valuable for our community moving forward. So thank you, Lee, for inviting me to be here. One of the reasons I'm here is because if you look in the Minnesota state statutes, you'll see the authorization for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And there's like 12 or 13 goals in there for us, but 3 of them are heavily related to economic development. How we build a multimodal system to support economics, how we build air systems to support us in being a global economic power, and how we move freight. So there's major goals in economic development within our actual law. So it's illegal for me not to be interested in this topic, basically. And it's also interesting, this study in particular, because I read an interesting statistic that 90% of the national GDP, based on the Bureau of Economic Analysis, is based in metro regions, which I think about, I'm like, well, that's easy then. We'll just put all the transportation money in the metro, and we'll call it a day, right? But unfortunately, the state has to worry about really the diverse economy of Minnesota and the entire state, from mining to agriculture to manufacturing. And it's just an incredible diversity that we have that Lee has told me has helped us do better from the recession than most states have done because of our diversity. And so that's great that we're diverse, but at the same time it creates real big challenges when you start looking at transportation and supporting economic development. Because each of these different industry clusters and businesses have different types of needs, and they need different types of, they need access to different types of things, whether it be smart, skilled people, or iron ore, or corn for ethanol. So there's just a wide variety of diversity. And to make things even better, right, we have a limited budget, and we need to really tighten our belts as we look at these diverse needs and make smart decisions. Right now, 50% of our pavements are older than 50 years old. 40% of our bridges are older than 40 years old. And so a lot of our funding goes towards sustainability and asset management type projects. And so as we look at expansion and supporting economic development, we need to be really smart about that. Another reason why this research is really important is because I think a lot of previous studies have been focused on, okay, we built a transportation project, now what happens economically? And the university, actually, Michael's sitting right here, a couple years ago, he did a study for us looking at, okay, we built this project, now what happened? We did great jobs. And we kind of looked at it and we weren't able to really find any real statistical evidence that anything happened. So you can build a bridge to nowhere. You can build a lonely highway. And so, I like to support transportation clearly, and I think that generally it does create good jobs and supports the economy and is the backbone of the economy, but really need to be smart about it. And I think that one way to do that is this angle that we're going with understanding our clusters, being better partners with the private sector, bringing together public sector and private sector ideas, so we can then look at the economy and then support the economy with our transportation plans rather than building transportation plans and then hoping, the economics will come behind it. And with that, I will go ahead and give it to Libby. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Libby.
So it's nice being able to have Phil start off with a statewide perspective as we come into the Metropolitan Council as the 7-county regional perspective. I occasionally think that Lee invites me to these things as an example of one of his grad students done well. And the Metropolitan Council certainly hasn't been an explicit part of some of the recent economic development conversations in our region, even though we have a very core role to play, in part as the regional partner to the statewide vision that Phil laid out. The Met Council's statutory role is for the orderly and economical development in the 7-county area, and our mission is to foster the efficient and economic growth for a prosperous metropolitan region. So having the council be part of conversations about regional economic competitiveness is very important. Some of what we do around planning for orderly and economic development is providing cost-effective wastewater treatment. So our cities pay wastewater treatment rates that are as much as 40% lower than other regions. If Michael Langley were still in the room, he'd be comparing our region's efficiency to the 800-some systems providing the same services in the Pittsburgh area. So that fact is one of the underappreciated realities of our region. The work that the council does working with MnDOT around planning for the efficient movement of people and freight, and really thinking about the quality of life, thinking about the amenities, thinking about the places that help attract and retain a skilled workforce. So in Michael Langley's early remarks, he talked about the importance of talent attraction and what attracts and retains knowledge workers to our metropolitan area. And we start to think about what that needs. We need to think about not only the job opportunities, but recognizing that many knowledge workers in today's economy are economically mobile. They can live wherever in the country they want to live, or wherever in the world they want to live. And with that economic mobility, how do we create the places and the quality of life that make them want to work here, want to move them here, and then look for the job opportunities to support the lifestyles they want. As we think about the numbers that Michael Langley laid out this morning about the number of new workers needed to support our ongoing economic prosperity, we need to also think about what are the housing needs to support that. Having jobs is great, having people in those jobs, but that then translates into housing and what are the land use and structural implications of that. So that brings me into the council's core role, which is really planning for the infrastructure of our region. The earlier presentations talked a lot about the corporate headquarters and didn't talk about one of the key assets that help keep this corporate headquarters here and thriving, which is the vitality of our international airport. Without that, those corporate headquarters would not be here. As we think about transportation and logistics as an industry, there's also the pavement underneath it. There's also the transit networks that help keep people here. There are the freight networks that move the biofuels to the processors here and across the world. So the council really wants to bring into this conversation what are the place needs of economic competitiveness, whether that is the transportation infrastructure, whether that is place, and how do we think more concretely about what these industries need, transportation, land use, infrastructure to make those businesses succeed. So in this ongoing conversation, I was listening to the conversation about robotics, thinking about biofuels, thinking about water technology, and thinking about what are the infrastructure needs that need to be in place, thinking about water supply, thinking about transportation. And so tying that all down, the Met Council works with the cities and townships in the 7-county area in local comprehensive planning, because ultimately it is the cities in our region who do the land use planning that create the places where our businesses thrive. So other than the mayor on my left, are there other city people who are in this room? That's what I suspected. So, two. So as we think about the conversation around economic competitiveness, as we think about these key industries that are driving our region's future, we also need to think about them in terms of place. We're here because we are a region where the title of this event is looking at regional clusters, so place matters. So the council wants to bring into the conversation how do we think about place and economic competitiveness strategically. Thinking about location efficiency from the perspective of our residents, where people live and where they work, from the perspective of our businesses, what are the physical needs of our businesses, what are the infrastructure needs of our businesses, and then thinking about how location efficiency adds up to an efficient region as we use Phil's money at MnDOT, all in the region, or at least strategically in the region to affect businesses moving forward. So thinking about location efficiency in this broader conversation.
Thanks, Libby. Peter.
Thanks very much. So to answer the question, how do we move forward? I think it's two pieces. It's time to choose and it's time to act. Great RMSP and McKinsey, starting this spring and into this summer, did a sector analysis that in many ways mirrored the cluster analysis that we saw today, and that was supporting the first ever regional economic development strategy that Mike talked about this morning. And we came to similar conclusions, which is validating and comforting for all of us to know. But it helps us understand we now have a clearer view of our data-driven competitive advantage, and that's really important. Because now we can start making decisions with a higher degree of confidence about where we should be spending our limited resources, not only our money, but also our time and attention. You know, the mayor, the University of Minnesota, the Met Council, MnDOT, there are a lot of systems and there are a lot of choices that we all make. To the extent that we can be aligning together and focusing in where the data says we are strongest, we are going to be most successful as a region. And so then that gets to the point of action. I think that starts with the knowledge sharing analysis that was done, which I think was quite interesting. And I admit I don't completely understand, so I look forward to asking more follow-up questions about that. But if the 21st century economy is based on connectivity, it's then about mobility. It's about the mobility of goods through a freight transportation system. It's about the mobility of people through a transit system, about information through an IT system. But then there's also this mobility of ideas and knowledge. And I think this is a hidden infrastructure system that does not get a lot of attention, but is very critical, especially if we have an innovation economy. And so one of the things that Greater MSP wants to work with all the partners at the table and many of you in the audience to do going forward in terms of how to act is to take a close look at this, the collaboration infrastructure in this region and in this state, and think about how we can modernize it and make it more efficient. So how we work together, how we circulate ideas, how we develop consensus, how we pick our priorities becomes in itself a competitive advantage. And that relates to some of the items that Mike was talking about this morning about how we're going to go forward. So with the story, you know, you have to align around our narrative. You know, we have to be saying internally and externally the same things about what we're good at. And then another hidden piece there that's very important was this idea that we're going to build some shared regional success indicators. So something that would be visible, transparent, that would encompass not only economy, but environment and society, so we can answer the question confidently, how are we doing? Because right now, depending on who you ask, how we're doing is a very different answer. And we need to have a clear view of that. We need to have a better infrastructure around talent. And this is building on all the conversations we've had already this morning. But we have an incredible asset base in this region. All the corporations, which have recruiting, professional development arms, foundations, the education institutions, this one and many, many others that recruit students, and they have alumni networks, and they have faculty recruiting, and then the young professional network and that whole ecosystem. All of those pieces are very, very rich in this region. But for the most part right now, they're very disconnected. And so we need to look for opportunities to set some shared goals as a region about where we need to get. We need to connect those resources. We need to focus them. We need to accelerate the action. We need to measure it. And we're going to have a lot of success. And we also, around sectors, we need to do two important things. Steve mentioned the competitive intelligence capability. We have a lot of research and analysis assets in this region. Many of them are sitting on this panel today, and there are many, many others. Just imagine if we start to have a little intentionality about coming together and saying strategically, what do we need to know to take full advantage of everything we heard today? What are the key questions? Some of them, and this isn't test tube research, a lot of this is going to be, you know, quite analytical and practical. And maybe we could share, you know, the responsibility for going after those answers and then share what we learned. You know, that's an important element of our knowledge infrastructure. And then sector teams. That was on the slide this morning. I'm not sure if you saw it, but the way we capture, to the question that Steve asked regarding water technology, the way we capture all these opportunities and vet these questions about workforce and policy and infrastructure is by building teams within these sectors. And that's what we want to, at Greater MSP, help catalyze within the region. So there are some ways to move forward.
Great. Thanks a lot, Peter. Tom.
Good. Well, I think I'm here in part because, as Steve said, I'm co-chair of the Metropolitan Consortium, which was partly the funder of this work, which is great. We're proud of that. We've been doing work related to our economic competitiveness in the region, and actually based on what Peter was just saying, I think the kinds of intentional interactions that you talked about are something that I think the Metropolitan Consortium could think about as perhaps convening or helping make happen certainly within the university, but also among partners there. I think one of our concerns as an entity, and by the way, the Metropolitan Consortium brings together everybody in the university concerned with metropolitan issues. So this ranges not just with the Humphrey School and colleges like mine, but it's public health, it's engineering, it's all the medical disciplines, ag. I mean, it's kind of everything that is concerned about how this region prospers. And so it's been a good way for us to have more intentional conversations around place, as Libby was just saying. But one of the things I think is clear to us is that as the pace of innovation increases, we have got to, as we've just heard from everybody else on this panel, be much more intentional about how we get together. So location matters a lot. I think colleagues of ours who were visiting a while back from Boston were saying that our problem as a region is we have our R&D is so scattered. And so much of it is at the edges, and it's not very close to the university. And that problem of not sort of running into each other is a real issue in this region. And whether, it's not likely that the corporate headquarters are all going to move, but maybe we, for example, need to think about skunk works or other kinds of informal ways in which our R&D capacity in our major industries is much closer to the university in a more informal way, where there are a lot of these interactions happening among the industry, faculty, and particularly graduate students, and see our labs in much more of a hybrid way, so that it isn't as if the university is doing one thing and the industry is doing something else, but where are these kind of collaborative research activities around shared laboratory space. I think another issue that we've been talking about is this idea that we're moving into what Jeremy Rifkin calls the third industrial revolution, the idea of mass customization rather than mass production. And so what does mass customization mean in all of our industries? And how can we, as we've heard this morning, leverage some of our advantage in robotics and 3D printing, some of the advanced manufacturing capacities that we have, to in fact think of ourselves as the first city in North America that is geared up for this third industrial revolution. We have the potential, we have the capacity for that, but that will mean a very different way in which we will be living, working, and making things. Again, sort of following what Libby was saying, I think place matters greatly in that regard, because what we see happening with mass customization is that we will no longer be largely living in one place, commuting to someplace else to work, with large industrial zones someplace else. That's the second industrial revolution model. So we're stuck in a city that's the shell of the old economy, and it's preventing us from moving quickly into the new economy. And so thinking about how we can begin to develop zones that would allow people to live, work, and make in close proximity, perhaps around hubs that would be 3D printing hubs, robotics hubs, virtual reality hubs, using some of the biotech hub equipment that is needed, and let industry and particularly startups start to gravitate around these economic hubs, I think is a new way to think about place and location. MinDrive is another piece that I'm involved in at the university. I'm on their advisory board, and also, again, so thinking about investments, in this case in food, bioremediation, neuromodulation, and robotics as an opportunity for us to leverage public investment in the university just to get these startups going, I think is an issue. We've heard about the problems of we're very good at R&D and corporate headquarters, but we're losing the manufacturing to other parts of the country or even to Canada. And I think that is an issue that we've got to look at. The university has an incubator facility in UEL, but we have this problem is that when you get too big, you have to leave, and there's no place for these companies to go. And so we're potentially losing a lot of industry here. So I think that's a critical issue. And then maybe finally, I'll just say a couple things. One, the talent attraction issue, as we look at this new economy, people are moving for quality of life reasons. And then they're starting up their careers and industries. And so we have to realize that all of these other issues, not just transportation, but parks and schools and all of the other infrastructure that we have to care for really is central to economic development right now. Our cultural institutions, these are all the attractors for global talent. And we have to see this as not something that's sort of nice to have kind of at the fringes. This is critical to our recruitment of talent in the future. And then finally, I think we need to do a better job of promoting what we do here. We are too Minnesotan in the way we don't talk about ourselves. I find it, I know colleagues of mine do as well, it's frustrating when I see other regions who have nowhere near the capacity that we have, and they're out there talking about themselves all the time. And you know, if Bruce Katz is right, if his book, The Metropolitan Revolution, is correct, and in fact, metropolitan regions are now the global economic units, we've got to be as vocal and as promotional as all those other competing metropolitan regions. We've got a great advertising industry here. I don't think we take enough advantage of them. And I think we need to construct a narrative that is much more about why this place is the best place in the world to be working and to be living. So with that.
Thanks, Tom. Jim.
Thanks, Steve. Well, first of all, Phil, as an ardent believer in region, I like your transportation funding strategy. With 74%,
For the record,
I
that
think,
is not
I don't know where you got your data, but I think 74% of our state's GDP is produced in this metropolitan region. And region and metro aren't words that I particularly warm up to, so I'm really pleased that we've developed this moniker of greater MSP, which I think tends to humanize us more than make us look purely like an economic unit. So with all deference to the great management consultant Peter Drucker, who said what got us here won't get us there, I think what got us here to this point today is exactly what's going to take us to where we need to be in the future. And here's why I say that from my perspective as a mayor and as a participant in the Regional Council of Mayors. When we hit the front end of the recession in '09, we came right to Lee Munich at the Humphrey and said, well, when we looked around the country, the places that were doing well, there was a combination of business, academia, and public sector folks working together to try to create a stronger economy. So we didn't even really understand where our strongest clusters were. And so with the mayors and the benefit of the good work at the Humphrey and some funding that we were able to secure, we started out on this project of looking at our clusters, which then evolved. We were running several different tracks at the same time. We ran the cluster study along with Itasca project. We were looking at whether or not we needed a regional economic development entity. That morphed into greater MSP. With Itasca taking the lead on that, the mayors having a more subsidiary role, we also launched into a regional metropolitan business plan, and I think Mary worked on some of that, and then we were also running a parallel track on export. So we got 2 grants from Brookings. One was for the Metropolitan Business Plan, developing a Metropolitan Business Plan. There were 5 cities that got that grant and that assistance. And then we launched in, because of the work we did there, they also picked us as a pilot for developing an export strategy for small business, because you remember in one of President Obama's early speeches, he said, our small businesses don't know how to make the world their market. We don't do as much exporting as most of the countries around the world. So it was us, Los Angeles, if you can believe that. They didn't have an export strategy, apparently just a world-dominating import strategy. And just by serendipity, really, Long Beach, and Portland, and then Syracuse, I think were the places that were picked. So we developed this export strategy as well, that then became an export plan, and now that's being piloted. It was piloted in Edina, and now it's being piloted in some of the bigger cities to see if what we came up with for a strategy actually works in practice. So all of that is going on. I mean, and that's taking us to the next point where we're going to be able to help our businesses push out into the world and have better success. And there's a great example of that in Edina. An Edina guy who has got his business in northeast Minneapolis, but he manufactures room dividers, like small partitions that you'd use to divide a room. And for 5 years, their business just kind of limped along, and then they decided to spend some money on Google, and now they spend $1 million a year on Google, and their business is global. And he's got a great story to tell, and it's a story that a lot of small businesses should embrace. So we are pushing forward with greater MSP. I would say for the mayors, we would push forward on two fronts. One is practical and one is policy driven. The practical side is now that greater MSP has completed its sector analysis. We're all going to rally around the narrative that we create, because we need a region that's speaking with one voice. We need a greater MSP to speak with one voice as to what we are and where we're going. And so we all need that same storyline. And we're going to work hand in glove with greater MSP as a mayoral organization and in our individual cities on this notion of retention, attraction, and expansion of our existing businesses. So we will help wherever we can on that strategy. On the policy side, you heard this morning, I got here a little bit late, but I heard somebody talking about the fact that we're doing a lot of R&D here. We're on the cutting edge of R&D in a lot of things, but now the manufacturing goes somewhere else. And there's a lot of reasons for that kind of activity going on. We don't want that to continue to happen in the future. So you think about what we can do from a governmental standpoint to help create jobs or lay the foundation, set the table for success. For me, personally, it's education, infrastructure, and research and development. Those are the three key prongs, I think, in terms of what government can do to set the plate for success for the private sector. And you heard some allusion to that this morning with respect to how the government got involved in creating the internet and doing other things that are critical to our digital age. So in terms of where we've been, I've talked a little bit about that. Where we're going, I think we'll start working hard on policy issues. I think from we've got 20 Fortune 500 companies here in our state, more per capita, I think, than any other state. A lot of them are homegrown. We need to find that next generation of entrepreneurs, and once they start up, we need to keep them here, and we need to allow them to grow here. That might mean some tweaking on some of the policies that we have from a tax policy standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint. All of those things need to be looked at. We've got a very, very high quality of life here, and we want to maintain that quality of life. You know, if we don't necessarily see a future where we're a low tax state. I mean, I remember Chris Coleman, the mayor of St. Paul, saying once, if low taxes were the key to success, Mexico would be the greatest place in the world to live. You know, so we have a wonderful place to live. We've been historically a higher tax state, but high taxes and high wages seem to have some correlation, and I think we need to be mindful of that as we go forward. So for me, it's just a matter of tweaking some policies and making sure that we help greater MSP prosper on the practical side, and that we work on the policy side with the legislature to create the kind of environment that'll give them the chance to have roaring success. And also working with MnDOT to make sure that our infrastructure can effectively and efficiently move people and goods in the way we need to have them moved.
Thanks a lot, Jim. So since transportation was the last point, I want to, and though I'm a longtime metro area resident and cheerleader, let me bring, if we were to locate a biomaterials manufacturing plant in Minnesota, it would not make sense to put it in the Twin Cities metro area. It would make sense to put it near the raw materials. And so I'm interested in the kind of thinking that the MnDOT is doing regarding the location of these new kinds of plants, because if you think about it from an efficiency perspective, the plant should be close to the raw material. That's why NatureWorks put its first PLA plant in Blair, Nebraska, because there was a rail line and there was corn.
Well, that's a very good question. I think first I'll just point out a couple facts. Number one, from idea of a transportation project to completion, I think we're averaging about 10 years, okay? And so we're moving so much slower than the idea of putting that plan in that, first of all, we need to look at our policy and how we can be more reactive to that type of private investment. We do have a small program that's called the Transportation Economic Development Program that has had some success in responding to with the solicitation. We do a competitive solicitation, mayors and such develop proposals, And one of the things that we're looking for is, number of jobs forecasted and that private sector partner that's going to invest in that part of in the area. A good example is actually in Eden Prairie, where there was a need for transportation access for United Health Group to develop their campus. And because United Health Group also contributed $8 million, we were able to create a package and move and accelerate that project forward faster. So the real truth is the planning process takes a while. The environmental process takes a while to be responded. And so we need to think about innovative ways like the TED program, I think, moving forward to be more responsive to that type of opportunity.
Great, thanks. So Libby talked about efficiency, and Tom talked about sort of where development is happening and the idea of hubs. Now, we're probably not going to move Stratasys out of Eden Prairie, or some of there's actually some interesting disk drive stuff happening down in Shakopee. So how do we balance the idea of concentrating people or concentrating some of these ideas in hubs and creating a more efficient metropolitan area, which at least Edward Glaser would argue, like taller core cities and building up rather than out. How do you think about this question of balance between folks who like to live at the edge and the efficiency that comes with more compactness? Libby?
I'll take a first crack at it. I think the biggest answer to how we balance it is to make sure that we have a metropolitan area that is offering a range of options, whether that is a range of options for people on where to live or a range of options for businesses on different types of places to locate. Certainly some of the larger industries that need the very big footprint are not likely to be in downtown Minneapolis. The flip side is that some of the businesses that have a high need for people coming to a specific place, our region's advertising industry is not locating in Eden Prairie. They're locating centrally because of the leverage of the downtown environment. And by offering that range of choices, we move more toward regional prosperity. The key thing to think about is on the residential side, we have a pretty clear idea of what future demographics will look like, and from that, what types of housing needs that will be. And there we see very clearly more single-person households, more older households, leading us to more density in the residential side. On the employment side, it's important to think about what is that mix of future industries in our region, recognizing that 30 years ago we may not have forecast that 3D printing would be emerging or some of the robotics that we saw this morning, but to think about what does the future hold, what are the physical needs of that, and making sure that we're providing that full range of options within our metro area so we're not leading people to locate elsewhere.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I guess to follow up, I don't necessarily think these hubs only have to be centrally located, although the fact is our research university is here, and we don't have other research universities out at the edges. And so to really maximize the talent attraction, I think it's got to be close in some place to some ways near the university. But I think another issue, and this actually gets to the infrastructure issue too, as we look at the impact of this new mass customization economy, people are going to be moving around a lot less. We actually may have way too much infrastructure. And I also sit on the Center for Transportation Board. I mean, there are a lot of roads in Minnesota where there's 1 or 2 cars a week. And so we are spending a lot of money maintaining a lot of infrastructure that we either don't need to, or in fact, we don't have the tax base to support the infrastructure we have. So I do think that we may be in a kind of a tipping point economically where, as Libby said, a lot of the demographics are moving toward people who want to live closer in or in more dense locations, but the economy is driving us in that way too. So I don't think this is top-down sort of government regulation. This is just, we provide the magnets and let the economy do what it's going to do, and I think it will sort of happen naturally.
So Peter and Jim, the notion of the mayors working with greater MSP, which is a strong private sector primarily organization, though it had a government fostered genesis. What do we need in order to build on that set of skills? I mean, the Center for Integrative Leadership is really interested in this question of how do we train people to work across these boundaries between government and the private sector and bring in academia and the role of nonprofits. What do the two of you see as the need for convening structures or other kinds of support to build on the collaboration that we've already started?
I think even in the last number of months, I see a lot of convergence happening across different sectors. And it seems like there's a lot of appetite from the public, private, nonprofit, educational, foundation world. We've seen the inefficiencies, we've experienced them, we see the opportunity to do more together, and there's an appetite to do that. So that's the first step. I think where we are now is having a lot of very direct conversations, which in Minnesota is a great thing. Having direct conversations about interest. What are you trying to do? What are your interests? What are our interests? And that's an important and essential conversation to have because, real partnership happens and real, accelerated action happens when two people realize they want the same thing or they want similar things and they're going to get there faster by working together. And so in each of those areas I was talking about, whether it's talent or it's storytelling or it's sector, those are the set of conversations we're having now. And not everybody's going to work together on everything. That's fine. That's okay. But working with the mayors, Greater MSP presented to the regional council mayors last week or the week before to lay this out to initiate that dialogue. And it's not always self-evident. And so it is a dialogue. We have to go back and forth, and it's a little bit of a shared learning process.
Yeah.
A couple observations, but most mayors are like me. You're serving your town in what's supposed to be a part-time job, which it often isn't. And so you might have two full-time jobs, like I do, but other people are much the same. And so they're private sector people at their core. And then they became elected officials. And so they understand the private sector really well. For a guy like me who's represented small business people and large businesses over the years, you have innate understanding of what's important for them. So that's a real plus, I think, when you start doing work in the public sector. When we came to Humphrey to work on the cluster study, for me it was a natural alignment. It's an easy partnership, I think, between the public sector and academia. I think it's maybe something that's always been there. There's historic good friendship there. I have to say that when we got invited to our first Itasca meeting, when we were talking about whether or not we should have a regional economic development entity, I felt like they wanted to pick us up like this and hold us at arm's length, and we're kind of wondering, well, who are these people that are here, these public officials? Because they weren't used to having us around. So we go to General Mills and meet at General Mills, and all these prominent business people who are there. And for the first time, we got 2 mayors or 3 mayors sitting there with them. And it took them a while, I think, frankly, to get comfortable with the idea. But now that's as natural a partnership as between elected officials and academia. And of course, you having been in both areas in your career, you have that. It was an easy transition for you, I'm sure, to go to teaching from private sector lawyer and then also a public servant serving your
Teaching
region.
was much harder, though.
Teaching was harder. Yeah, well, I can see that. My wife's a teacher. I have a high regard for, and my parents too. So. Anyway, those
Great.
are my observations.
Thanks. So we have a couple minutes before we transition to a broader conversation for a couple questions from all of you. Yes, sir.
We want a mic. We've got mics here too, so.
For Bill doesn't need a mic.
Well, we want it's being taped, so. Where is it?
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll
Thank
get
you.
geared
We've
up
got
for-
people who are gonna walk around with the mics, and introduce yourself.
Very good, Lee. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it coming through? Okay. Bill Goins with FedEx, also acting chair of the Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee. And my question, certainly for all the panel, good comments this morning. Thank you. I may even direct this one a bit towards Phil. I started the morning at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast where Commissioner Zelli spoke along with others on a panel. And he did a really nice job of talking about the shortfall that we will experience between now and 2024 in terms of the infrastructure that the state needs. And we're talking to the tune, per his slides and comments, of about $50 billion. Big number. Now, we could probably talk about that number all day, but let's say it's realistic. And, Commissioner made a great job. Efficiencies are number one, but there's still a funding gap. So, Phil, you've talked a little bit about public-private partnerships. And one of the other things the Commissioner talked about this morning was ROI. And there's been a stakeholders task force that has been looking at ROI on transportation investments. So can you possibly enlighten us a little bit how return on investment, maybe in a public-private partnership, could help us reduce that gap?
Phil?
Wow.
Sorry, I should have made it easier.
That's a wonderful question. Well, first, it depends on what you mean by public-private partnership. There's partnerships where there's funding partnerships, and the state continues to design, build, finance, and operate, maintain roads. And then there's the partnership where we start mixing and matching that, and we look for efficiencies. And we develop more large contracts where, let's say, the private sector would come in and do things that the state would traditionally use state resources for. But overall, I think as far as our ROI and the way that we've been doing it, we generally have to assess risk to quality of life, and these include things that aren't just commerce related and aren't just traffic related or congestion related, but they also include qualitative things that we account for, like safety and life cycle costs so the asset management piece. So when we look at ROI, we try to look at a kind of a profile of different needs, including the return we get from things such like as travel time savings and things like that. And so I think with public-private partnerships, you can add ROI to a certain extent through accelerating projects. So you're now, for example, with the United Health Group example I brought up earlier, we were able to now accelerate that project because there was a funding gap through partnering with that individual company. Now, in the future, the reason why I love this research is like, the question that I have is, what can we do as far as partner with an industry cluster? How do we get a better idea of how these clusters are linking together and their access needs, and can we partner with that cluster rather than an individual? So I think you get better ROI through accelerating projects. The calculation is going to be a little bit different than probably in the private sector because of some of the qualitative things that we need to address. But in the end, if we can take the TED model, that Transportation Economic Development Program model, and not look at individual projects, but look at it from a system view and partner with industry clusters, the competitive ones, the ones that are moving our state forward, then I think that we'll be able to get better return for state money.
Libby?
If I may also respond to this one, thinking about ROI, your original question, make me think about the work that the Itasca Project released about a year ago in terms of research on the ROI of transit investments. And they looked at ROI very much from a private sector perspective, looking at improved workforce accessibility and reliability because of transit investment in the metro region, as well as looking at the impact on congestion, looking at time costs, travel time, a very holistic approach. So for those interested, I'd encourage you to go out and look at it. The reason I highlight it is that I think it's a good example of improving the partnership between those of us in the public sector who historically we provide the infrastructure that other people use, but rather making it more of a conversation, a dialogue, and a partnership so that it becomes the private sector advocating for, here's the type of infrastructure that we need in order to improve our profits and be economically successful.
So Libby and Phil, let me follow up on that question a little bit in relation to this question of competitive intelligence. So you're talking about a thoughtful way of measuring transportation return on investment. And Libby, during her earlier comments, talked about sort of how do we assess the efficiency of the services that we're providing. How do we, if we're taking one approach, how do we develop something that gives us comparability with our competitors or our peers who may be not, in terms of their own data, not taking as thought or as, our kind of approach to these questions? How might we think about that issue as we address the notion of competitive intelligence?
Well, Lee and I are discussing that. We discussed that yesterday. So I think these are really the tough questions that we're trying to answer with the university. I mean, we've talked about something called, instead of a location quotient, which they used in this study, a transportation quotient. And here's an industry that's doing well in Duluth, and it's got a competitive advantage. It's got a good location quotient, but what's its transportation quotient? What mode does it need? And is it actually going to be productive for us to go in and do a transportation project there? I mean, these are all very, very tough questions that we're going to continue to work with the university on to try to answer. But I think the goal is eventually that we'll get some kind of model that we'll be able to look at competitive advantage, whether it's emerging or creating jobs and moving the economy forward, whether it needs some kind of transportation infrastructure or it's more of a knowledge flow issue. And then, what is the bottom line? What is it going to do for our gross product as a state? And so those types of things, I think when we think about, we can eventually come and develop some kind of model to help us get a better idea, at least on the economic development part, for return on investment, acknowledging that that's just one part. We still have these other things like safety and asset management to do.
Libby.
In most of the leadership literature, people say, know yourself, know your strengths, and that's how individuals thrive. I think the same model goes for regions. So pulling off of some of what the greater MSP message is telling our stories, but telling our stories and understanding ourselves as a collective region, what our strengths are and what our opportunities are so that we can really build on our strengths both today and in the future to come. There's certain aspects of economies that our climate is not going to support. At least in the short term, we're not going to start growing palm oil. But over the long term, to think about who we are, how we thrive in a data-driven perspective can only be positive for our future.
Great. Peter, you want to?
Okay, well, it's so nice.
So Minnesota.
Bill, your comment about the $50 billion, and that's not the first time most of us have heard that number, but it just rings. I mean, $50 billion. I think the other thing it challenges us to do, and this is core to the idea of competitiveness, is innovation. So if $50 billion is a real number, it's a good moment for us all to stop and step back and think, okay, how else could we get to the outcomes that we're seeking? And I think in transportation, in education, in a lot of ways, the models that we have been using are being stressed by all kinds of resource constraints and other external constraints. And they really force us to entertain some very different ideas. And in this state, we have a tradition of being innovative not only in the private sector, but also in the public sector. And I think it's the combination of that innovation and how it pervades our culture that has been part of the secret sauce about this region. And I think we are at one of those stages now in terms of our economy and society in general, where it's a real call to innovation.
Tom?
Well, I agree. I mean, I think that we have to also realize we keep thinking about capital in terms of financial capital. We are rich in human capital, social capital, all sorts of intellectual capital that we don't factor in this innovation quotient. I mean, one of the I did a chapter in a book on the I-35W bridge collapse. I mean, to me, the interesting thing is how much we all adapted so when that bridge wasn't there, we didn't have traffic jams, which raised the question, did we need to rebuild that bridge? Now, I mean, I think there were other reasons why we had to, for political and all sorts of other reasons, but that's the kind of thing, every time we are encountering something like a $50 billion bill, we have to ask, do we need to do what we continue to do? Because, you know, if you accept the premise that I was making, that we are in a totally different economy, we have to stop building the 20th century. And that's what I think we're doing. And we can't afford it anymore.
We're going to shift to a different part of the program, so please join me in thanking our panel for their really stimulating remarks.